Hello, in this demonstration, I am going to explore transparency using golden high flow and fluid acrylics, and I'm going to use them on different substrates, those being watercolor paper, fabric, and canvas paper. But first, in the first part, I'm going to do a gradation of, here's my fluid. It usually comes in a jar with this flat top, and the high flow in this dropper bottle. Now, the reason for doing the gradation is to explore creating transparency with the high flow and fluid acrylics. And we're creating transparency by adding water. But the difference is the pigment content in these paints is very high. So a little bit goes a long way. I'm going to start with this. It's a phthalo green. This is straight phthalo green with no water. So it's very dense. It's very dark. Okay. And I like using this flat brush. I'm using it on watercolor paper. Now I'm going to add a little water to lighten that up. So this is different than acrylic, regular acrylic paints, where if you want to make things lighter, you're either doing it by mixing a lighter paint in or adding more water. If you keep adding more water, the pigment or the chroma the integrity begins to break down. With these, less so. Okay, so I add a little bit of water. Okay, and then I'm going to keep going. I experimented with this. It seems like if I keep pulling across, it will just gradually get lighter on its own as the paint comes off the brush. Going to add a little more water. If I had a longer strip of paper, I could just keep going. So a little bit goes a long way. I'm going to bring it down to here. And I don't know of any other acrylic paints besides golden. They might exist that have this high a pigment content with the transparent paints. So we're going to play with this more. I think it's fun to play with the gradations and get a sense of what this paint can do. Okay, that's all about in the same range there now. Got to add even more water. Okay, well, I think you get the basic idea. Now I'm going to test out the fluid, which is slightly thicker, maybe the word is viscous, than the high flow. So here it is straight. Now I'm going to add water. Oops. Well, muddied the color there now. This pigment is super intense. I have to really wash my brush out. Well, it's not a pure, I think, what is this color? Indian yellow hue. I can also just drag it this way and then it should, wow, it's really not, but that shows you the intensity. I have hardly any paint on there and I have this line of almost pure color, same gradation going across the page. Okay, I think they're both, the pigment is intense in both, but I find the high flow even more intense. That's the one in this bottle. It's almost like a dye. Okay, so those are my gradations. I can add those to my color dictionary if I want. Now I'm going to use some of these paints on, I'm going to go on canvas paper. And I'll be exploring some of the same techniques with the canvas paper, the watercolor paper, and the fabric, but different substrates react differently. So this has got gesso, so it's not going to be as absorptive. I am going to use my large wash brush and put down some water for the paint to bleed into. Okay, here goes the high flow. You can see it bleeding here and how it's really is like a dye, the intensity of the color. Okay, I'm going to bring in another high flow color, which is this quinacridone magenta. I'm going to use a string that I've soaked in water so it's damp. We've done this before, but I'm going to run it through the high flow. A damp string will work better. It'll absorb. I already need more paint. Okay, absorb some of that paint. And I can make some marks with the high flow. If I go in the wet areas, it's going to bleed. I get a finer line. You can play with drips if you want. I'm not going to do it right now because my canvas paper is tacked down. So when I overlap with the transparent paint, I'm going to get another color. Now these are complementary, so I don't really know what that color is. It does look a little purpley. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my fluid here and bring that in. Again, if I overlap, it's almost like stained glass. I'm going to get a secondary color. If you want it to be really sharp, you would wait for the paint below to dry. Other things I can play with are in wet areas dropping in some of the high flow directly. So this is an indigo. I'm going to see what happens when I drop it into this magenta here. That's pretty cool. A little bit goes a long way. Probably would have been better to do it with a brush, actually. I don't even need that much. Just a little dot of that. Okay, so that's on canvas. Now I'm going to go to cotton fabric. So I have my cotton fabric here and it is taped down to, I have a sheet of watercolor paper underneath. You want to put some sort of paper below it. Like if I had the cotton fabric taped on this contact paper, it's just going to pool and then turn to mud. So I don't want that. the watercolor paper below is going to absorb some of this paint. Okay, so I'm going to try and do Helen Frankenthaler's soap stain method. So I'm going to add a little bit more water to this high flow. And I'm just going to make drop the paint on there. So you can see that the paint, it bleeds out, but it's not out of control, right? It doesn't go that far. Okay, now I'm going to pick, I'm going to go to the green that I had. And I'm going to put it in between this magenta to see if it bumps up. It should bump up and stop. Yeah, it does. Well, it bleeds into it a little bit. If I go just a little bit in back of it, it should bleed up to that pink and stop. I'm going to go closer, see what happens. You know, it probably stops because the fabric absorbed all that it can and it's not going to go further. That would be my guess. Okay, I can drop paint in some of these other shapes. I can play with that. But if I keep going and adding more paint, at a certain point, it'll just turn to mud, or it'll be so saturated I can't add any more paint. It's like a sponge. Okay, now I'm going to try and wet the fabric and then drop paint in and watch what it does. Okay, this is the fluid. Okay, here it is on the wet. So if you're painting on wet fabric, the only thing I've noticed is when it dries, it's going to be a little bit lighter than that. It's going to be more diffuse. You can also add salt if you want to get a speckle effect. You could play with the rubbing alcohol and see what that does. I'm going to bring in one more color here. This Van Dyke Brown High Flow. Okay, so that is on cotton fabric. Now what I'm going to do is sometimes the paint will go through onto the watercolor paper below and make a really nifty pattern. I don't really have enough paint going on to do that, but I'm going to do some painting on this sheet of watercolor paper. And this will react differently than, it'll be absorptive, but not as absorptive as the cotton fabric, but more than the canvas paper. Another thing you can play with is if you have charcoal pencils, you can do some drawing, or it could be a regular pencil, and the transparency, those marks should be showing through that transparent paint. Okay, now here's the fluid, slightly thicker. So see, I like, here it's sharp, and then here it bleeds into that magenta. Really nice. Here's the Van Dyke Brown, high flow. I'm not thinking about composition right now. I'm just playing with color interaction and absorption, seeing what the paint can do. Once you feel comfortable, then you can set out to maybe do a more structured or planned out composition if you want. But save these studies. I think maybe at some point we'll build more opaque paint on them. You do a little string here with what's left over. I'll just run it through all of my paints. Just use that up. Who knows what color I'll get. Okay. If you're going to string paint, you do have to have it pretty well saturated. This is pretty light right now. Thicker paint will give you a more defined line. But I think just by playing, you're going to get some things that, like, that's pretty fun to me. I like all the movement and energy going on in there. And I'll probably come back later and do a little more work on it. So we've done gradations and transparency, high flow fluid acrylic on different substrates, canvas, fabric, and watercolor paper. But you can play on other surfaces as well if you want. It could be a paper bag. It could be rice paper, really whatever you have within reach. Okay.